Governor, thank you for coming today. I know you've got a full schedule, and it's good to see you. It seems like I run into you all around the world. I saw you in Helsinki a few weeks ago, and I always enjoy coming to Paris.
And I'm just arriving from New York City, so
good
afternoon to everybody.
I hope you didn't take Amtrak down. You are in a blackout period, a quiet period, so you can't talk about monetary policy, but there's a target-rich environment for all the other issues that you and I have worked very closely on. And let's start with one that you and I collaborated on over the past, actually 2 years, and that's on debt transparency, debt sustainability. You've shown great leadership individually. Obviously, the French government has traditionally been a leader in terms of the Paris Club and debt negotiations. But how do you see this, and how worried are you about the rapid accumulation of debt we've seen in this cycle? We're up 70 trillion, 320% of GDP, 246 trillion, household, corporate, sovereign. We have run up our credit cards. Are you worried?
One word about sustainability, which is probably a key feature for our conversation. It's not a nice to have, because the sustainable word is very fashionable at present. It's a must have. And it's true for debt sustainability. Let me start with this issue and perhaps quote some figures in order to give you a magnitude. Some figures about world debt, and then we should focus perhaps about African debt, where we work together
Absolutely.
with the IIF. About the world debt, 3 very simple figures. And I put the overall figure adding public debt, private debt, be it households or corporates, as you mentioned. And I take all countries, advanced economy and emerging economies, and I compare it to world GDP. This is probably the simplest figure and the simplest measure of the size of the debt problem. If we start in 2001, so 6 years or 7 years before the great financial crisis, world debt was about 190% of world GDP. It increased till the great financial crisis. The same figure, 2007, is about 210% of world GDP. But what is more worrying is that this increase went on after the crisis. And we are now, last year, 2018, at 230% of world debt compared to world GDP. So this is a global figure again. It means a very simple conclusion. We are not over with the debt question. And we know it was a major cause of the great financial crisis. We should be very vigilant about the evolution of global debt. Let me now focus on the region or the topic we work together successfully with the IIF. And this is the debt of the low-income countries. Let me focus on Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and let me focus on public debt. Here, the figures are much smaller, and we could say it's not a systemic issue, which is true. But this is a significant issue for the African countries themselves. If you look at the level of public debt compared to their GDP, after the great financial crisis, let us say as an average between 2009 and 2013, it was about 28% of their GDP. If you look now, 6 years later, it's close to 50%. So a very significant increase. And here we can do something. Solving the world debt question is obviously a very comprehensive task, a multilateral one. But avoiding the next African debt crisis, this is our responsibility, and this is within our reach. The IMF estimates that among the about 50 low-income countries, most of them are African, now about half of them are again in a situation of debt stress or are at high risk in being in a debt stress situation. Can I say that this is a collective failure? Because you remember, Tim, that 20 years ago, the international community, under the sponsorship of Michel Cansu, at the time managing director of the IMF, decided the so-called HIPC initiative, High Indebted Poor Country, with a very significant debt relief for many African countries. And we thought some years ago that the African debt question was behind us, was solved. It's no longer the case, unfortunately. So, there is a global question of debt, stress, but there is a local question which is of utmost importance, not for the world equilibrium, but for the health of these countries and their populations. And it's why we decided, but we will probably elaborate about that, to have within the G20 principle for the debt sustainability and the debt governance, and it's why the IIF followed suit with these principles on debt transparency adopted in the first half of this year, this precise year, and I greatly welcome what the IIF did. Now, as we know, Tim, there is a very serious question and challenge of implementation.
Indeed. I guess I'm supposed to then say, yes, it is tough. For those of you who don't know, we had the G20 endorse our principles on debt transparency, and they did so in Fukuoka earlier this summer. The question now, and it's on transparency, where we're building a repository, collecting private sector data flows. The question is, who collects it, how do you collect it, where is it housed, and how do you access it? And so we're working through it. There's a quartet we're working with the World Bank and the IMF and the BIS and ourselves. So operationalizing it is a bit of a challenge. But we, the private sector, are committed to ensuring that we're good citizens in this endeavor. We just need to make sure the public sector is there with us as good partners.
It's not my role today to decide who will be the repository. For those of you who are less familiar with the issue, an important prerequisite of these principles of debt transparency is to have a database on private credits, obviously. And so there should be a repository, and the question is who will host this database? It could be the IIF itself, if I may, Tim. It could be public organizations, it could be a combination, it could be others. But I have an urgent call for action. We shouldn't kick the can down the road and say, it's not me, it should be you who will be the repository. It's a technicality, an important technicality, but at the end, we must deliver. If I dared say, perhaps you must deliver, but if we can help on the public side. But I wouldn't want the significant progress made within the G20 with its debt operational principles 2 years ago. And among private creditors, and again, I welcome the IIF job about this principle on debt transparency, I wouldn't like it to remain an empty shell and not being implemented. So I have today 2 messages, a positive one, we strongly welcome the IIF principles, and a less positive one, or a more alarming one, saying we should walk our talk now. Yeah. So I trust the IIF that you can find a technical solution. We are ready to help as we can, but we shouldn't wait too long.
I firmly agree, and you have a committed partner with us in this journey.
Which is good news.
In this journey. Let's turn to another issue that you're quite passionate about, and one which is taking up a tremendous amount of our time, and for a positive reason. We're very happy about what we're doing, and that's in green finance, environmental sustainability. I know that's something dear to you. It's dear to your government. The French have played an important role for a very long time on the climate issue. We're meeting with the Network for the Greening the Financial System in just a short period of time. What role should central bankers, what role should policymakers play in helping the private sector as we think about taxonomy issues and disclosure, benchmarking? What's your role?
This is obviously a very important question. And you said this issue is dear to my heart. It's probably dear to most of our hearts within this room, I guess. And this raises sometimes suspicions. Let us be frank about it. Is it a nice to have issue? Do you want to be nice guys? Are you central bankers politically influenced or politicized even, following the trend, so to say? Clearly no. And let me insist on one thing. Taking into account climate change within our financial stability mandate, and even within the monetary policy mandate, and these are for me two separate heads, financial stability and monetary policy, this is not a nice to have, it's a must have. This is not politicization, it's part of our mission. For a very simple reason, and this is probably the first message of this network for greening the financial system, NGFS, which we created. I will speak a bit about it. But this very simple conviction is the following one. In the long run, climate risk is a significant part of the financial risk we should monitor and supervise. There is no doubt that climate change will have, in the long run, strong economic consequences. If I had to put it in a nutshell, at the macro level, it's probably a long-term but certain stagflationary shock with increase of some prices, at least energy prices, and, if we don't act, detrimental effects on growth. And so, this is a macroeconomic picture, but if you look at the microeconomic, the sectorial effects due to the transition risk can be extremely strong. So what we decided is 2 years ago in Paris, it was December 2017, to create this network for greening the financial system. We started at eight central banks and supervisors. We are now about 50. Mostly central bank and supervisors from the 5 continents, but also international organizations like the IMF, for instance. This is a clear sign of success, of commitment. It's a coalition of the willing, and it creates much commitment, much energy. If I could say, Tim, it's even much enthusiasm. And I know that sometimes when I speak of enthusiastic central bankers, it looks like an oxymoron. But believe me, we are very enthusiastic about that, and we are serious. Again, it's linked to our mandate. So there are probably 3 categories of issues to deal with. Let me only mention them, and then I can elaborate if you have further questions. First is the monitoring of risks. This is an issue of disclosure by banks, insurance, or non-financial firms. But it's also the issue of stress test, because the disclosure, it's a snapshot of risk. It's still more important to have what I call the video of risk, because as said, these are long-term risks, in 10 years or 20 years. So we should be able to look forward and to simulate the long-term risk which are in the balance sheet of banks, insurance, or other financial institutions. We are able to do it in the economic field through stress test. We should elaborate this technology of climate-related stress tests. This is a clear priority of the NGFS. So this is the first basket, so to say, about monitoring risk, snapshot and video. The second basket, you mentioned it, is about developing green finance. Right. And this is the opportunity side. There are risks, but there are also significant opportunities. Here it's very promising what private players and what financial markets delivered. The development of green finance, be it green bonds, green loans, etc., is very promising. But may I add that it's a bit fragile, because there are many different definitions of what a green bond is, for instance, and these are still private definitions. It's where the issue of taxonomy, which you mentioned, is probably of utmost importance. And at the European level, because it's probably one field where Europe has the lead at present, the European Commission and its so-called Technical Expert Group, TEG, proposed a taxonomy of green assets and green financing. We'll see how it evolves, but I think it's very necessary if we want to develop quantitatively green finance. to deal with this qualitative fragility we still have. And the third basket is about monetary policy, but this is perhaps another question.
On the taxonomy issue, I've seen the Commission's report. It's 500 pages. It's very detailed, very prescriptive. If it is indeed implemented, isn't that exacerbating the fragmentation, the regulatory fragmentation issue, which it's an issue we talk about here, where Europe goes ahead of everyone else, the U.S. far behind. You have enormous differentiation in the way in which each jurisdiction thinks about these issues. And then how do you compensate for Europe being in one place and just for argument's sake, U.S. somewhere else? How do you?
No, Tim, it should be exactly the contrary, diminishing fragmentation. At present, we have a very significant fragmentation. We have, if I look only at Europe, we have several private definitions. And let me put it this way. If you are a green bond issuer, you more or less define yourself why you are green.
That is correct.
This is the maximum fragmentation.
Right.
So we could start with a European common definition, which would be already a very significant progress. And if I may stress it, in this regard, I would wish Europe to include UK, because I think it would greatly help. We had this Brexit agreement this morning. We will see how it evolves in the coming day, but it's good news. And clearly, here Europe should include the UK in this work about taxonomy. But you are right. This journey is led by Europe at present, but it should not remain Europe-centric. And I would strongly welcome this European contribution to foster a multilateral work, perhaps in the framework of the FSB, in order to have a global taxonomy, if possible. It would probably require, how could I express it, a somewhat stronger involvement of some very important jurisdictions of the FSB, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I know, yes. One of the component pieces of the Commission approach is greening and browning factors, capital factors. You got capital relief for whatever's defined as green, Brussels defines as green, and brown, whatever's defined as brown, there's a capital charge. Is nuclear green or is nuclear brown?
I'm a bit cautious with this notion of green supporting factor or brown penalizing factor. First, let me explain why it comes on the front stage, for obvious tactical reasons. The financial industry, starting with the banks, saying a green supporter factor would be a great idea because it would diminish my capital requirements. And then, on the side of regulators, there could be a temptation to saying it's exactly the opposite. I should apply brown penalizing factor in order to increase your capital requirements. We don't go very far with this tactical debate. The real issue, in my viewpoint, is that we should stick to the risk analysis. And I come back to what I said. It's not nice to have question and saying if you are more green in your assets, you are a nicer bank and I will encourage you. It's because we think that you have less risk. If you finance brown assets, clearly brown, and I will not enter in the taxonomy, but we all have examples, probably in the long run, in some years, you have very significant transition risk. So we should take them into account in our supervision. Does it require brown penalizing factor? I don't know at this stage. But I know that in assessing the risk, we should incorporate this long-term climate risk. I'm not sure we need green supporting or brown penalizing, but we should stick to the risk analysis. This is our core mandate.
But transition's important. Moving from coal to gas to renewables is an important process rather than just trying to make the jump from coal to renewables, right?
Yes, and this raises a very important point, Tim. There could be a temptation, perhaps in the public debate, to say green finance is the solution to the climate transition and the energy transition. And monetary policy, this will be my only sentence about monetary policy. Monetary policy here, again, could perform miracles. Monetary policy is sometimes supposed to deal all the economic challenges we have, and it could also solve the climate challenge. The simple answer is no. Green finance can help. Financial institutions and financial regulation can help. Monetary policy can help. But it cannot replace adequate public policies in order to accelerate this transition. This means energy policies, this means transportation policies, this means building policies, etc. And it means, very probably, also taxation. I don't know if you noticed it, in the last reports just published by the IMF, as you know, there are traditionally three economic reports: World Economic Outlook, Global Financial Stability Report, and the so-called Fiscal Monitor. This year, and this is a very powerful message, the Fiscal Monitor, which is about fiscal policy, be it taxes or expenditure, has only one chapter and one theme. And this is, to put it in a nutshell, carbon tax. So, green finance, sound regulations, monitoring of risk, monetary policy can incorporate climate risk, must incorporate climate risk, but it cannot replace adequate public policies.
And you think
it cannot be, again, in that field, the only game in town.
And are consumers ready to pay higher taxes on carbon-intensive products or energy?
This is very probably a question beyond my reach, Tim. No, it's a difficult political question.
We've seen it in France, some unhappiness.
The government has seen it in France. There are countries, including in Europe, where such a carbon tax, especially in Northern Europe, has been introduced and increased progressively, but clearly it requires an extensive political debate, and there are solutions, but this is not my field. I'm not responsible for tax policy, where you can compensate households with other tax cuts, etc. But obviously, like any tax decision, it's a delicate political debate. But this is what our democracies are for. Right. We cannot ignore this threat. We cannot ignore the need for changes. And there is considerable pressure from our public opinion in all European countries, including in this country too. This is the most common threat we have. So we must have this debate.
One area where we can work more closely, we, the public and private sector, is on the analytics of measuring carbon footprint. For example, I met with one of our large European institutions this summer that said to me, if we fund a LED lighting facility that replaces an incandescent lighting facility, we don't know how to account for the positive impact on our carbon footprint. We don't know how to benchmark it. We don't know how to report it. We don't know how to explain it. We don't have the methodologies, and we've started working on those work streams. That, to me, seems like a place where the public sector can also help as we try to come up with a common set of approaches, a common set of methodologies.
No, I do agree. This is not up to central banks and supervisors, but I do agree. Can I say one word, Tim, about monetary policy? Or two words. The first one is to say that Christine Lagarde has shown a strong interest in this question in her hearings facing the European Parliament. And second, that at this stage, we at the Banque de France think that there are at least two avenues which are promising within our mandate. I stress it again, our mandate is price stability. If politicians decide to broaden our mandate, it's a different story. But our mandate is price stability, and so there are two promising avenues consistent with this mandate. The first one is, as I said very quickly earlier, to incorporate the long-term economic effects of climate change within our economic models and analysis. We know they will happen, and we already see sometimes short-term effects which come earlier than expected. To quote you a German example, I don't know, Tim, if you are aware of it, One of the reasons for the German slowdown last year, summer 2018, was the low level of the Rhine. I don't know if you remember that. There are many other reasons for the German slowdown, but here we could see a short-term effect of the climate change. And it disturbed the chemical sector because it disturbed transportation, etc. So we should incorporate, in the broad view, the effects of climate change in our economic models. This is a strategic avenue. What I call the operational avenue is that we all know that monetary policy is about collateral. We take collateral. We assess the risks of this collateral on financial indicators. We should incorporate an assessment of the climate-related risk of this collateral. It raises many technical questions, but I think it's an avenue we could follow in the future, again, very consistently with our mandate.
And are there ways the public sector can encourage, we go back to green bonds, could the ECB buy green bonds as a part of their purchase program? Are there ways
but the ECB already buys green bonds. We have a significant amount of green bonds. It should be consistent, again, with our mandate and also with the size of the market.
And and the ECB has a standard definition for what they consider to be green.
It's not a class of assets which is specified in our monetary policy. And again, I think that a broader view incorporating the climate risk of each category of asset we buy is still more powerful and more promising. But obviously, green bonds in this aspect would have an advantage.
Wonderful. And the last couple of minutes we have here, I'm going to turn to one other issue that you've talked about over the last 2 years, and that's venture capital and risk capital in Europe, or the absence of a sufficient level of risk capital. Where are we? Where is Europe in this process? What should be done? What could be done in order to see more risk capital evolve?
This is the issue of the so-called capital markets union in Europe. For a very simple reason. First, we have the resource. If you look at private savings in Europe, it's very abundant. And we have an excess of savings towards investment of more than 300 billion euros per year. We have very significant investment needs for energy transition, as said, for innovation and digitalization, and yes, for venture capital and the scaling up of our SMEs. I don't know if you are aware of one figure, which is clearly the American advantage. If you take corporate equity compared to GDP, it's about 120% in the US, and it's only 80% in the euro area. It's one of the causes of Europe lagging behind in innovation. It's not the only cause, but we all know that innovation is financed better through capital and through equity than through loans, because it's more risky. So how can we channel these abundant resources towards the significant investment and innovation needs we have? This is the purpose of Capital Market Union. It would also play a very powerful and positive macroeconomic role because it would bring stabilization in case of asymmetric shocks. If you look at the American economy, if there is an asymmetric shock, let's say for one state, one of the 50 states, we know that in America, the capital markets channel is a very powerful stabilization factor, much more than the budget. So we should activate it in Europe. We all agree about that, and I see my Italian colleague and friend Ignazio Visco here. We are neighbors in the Governing Council, so it's my pleasure to see him again in Washington. The 19 governors completely agree about the acceleration of this capital markets union, because for the obvious reasons I mentioned, it should be our priority, and there are no political roadblocks. But we don't deliver yet. We don't deliver yet, probably because it's a technical agenda. There are other reasons, but there are 5 to 10 measures looking to insolvency laws, harmonization,
Right,
probably
prospectus reform.
of venture capital, accounting, etc. None of these boxes I just mentioned is very exciting, to be frank. So there should be a stronger brand, probably, because when you say Capital Markets Union, it's very difficult to explain to European citizens or European households or even European corporates that you will solve that problem. One suggestion could be to speak about a union for investment, for savings and sustainable investment,
Right.
and we would have the idea of sustainability.
Right.
And then we should have a strong political push and saying there are 10 technical measures to be fostered or prepared by the Commission and elaborated with Council and Parliament, but we should deliver on this agenda in the 5 next year. Why the 5 next year? Because we have a new Commission and a new Parliament. I strongly hope it will be the case. There has been a very good report by some European personalities called Next CMU report. There will be now 3 task forces created by the Commission in order to have a precise agenda at the start of next year. But we need a powerful brand and we need a political push. If you allow me one parallel, many of you in this audience remember the single market of Jacques Delors and others. The single market was also technically boring. 300 directives, very technical. We need only probably less than 5 to 10 directives for this financing union. But the genius of Jacques Delors and the politicians at that time was not to speak about the 300 directives, was to speak about the 4 freedoms of circulation, goods, services, capital, and persons. This is exactly the kind of brand and political push we need to develop this union for savings and sustainable investment, including, as you said, venture capital. I strongly believe this is the next step of strengthening the European economy.
Governor, as always, it's a pleasure to see you. I've enjoyed working with you this year, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, please give him a round of applause.
Thank you.